So I'm going to talk a little bit about the experiences that I had interviewing elderly Yiddish speakers in Ukraine between about 2000 and 2010, where I made about 10, 15 trips. I can't remember exactly how many, to mostly to Ukraine, but also a little bit to Romania, Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia, looking for elderly Yiddish speakers living in small towns in these regions to talk about their lives and how they survived communism, how they survived the Holocaust, and what they were doing at that time. This was already now, the interviews that I did were already now about 20 years old, 20, almost 25 years old. It was a very different time in Ukraine before Ukraine was ravaged by war, by the Russian full-scale invasion. And times were different. And I do want to say that I, have a lot of sympathy for the people of Ukraine who are suffering through this right now, and for the people that we interviewed, most of whom are no longer around, or at least no longer in Ukraine. I'm going to share my screen because I'm going to be showing you a bunch of videos of the interviews that we did. And I'll talk a little bit about the types of people that we interviewed and what they said and the experiences that we heard. But I'll do that when I share a screen. I will say also, I'm using a brand new computer. So I hope that I'm not going to mess anything up here. And I'm also speaking to you from a hotel room, so not at my usual desk. So with those caveats, I hope I can still make things work. And it does seem that I'm sharing my screen, that it is working. So these interviews we did, I then published as a book called In the Shadow of the Shtetl, Jewish Memories of Small Town Life in Post-War Ukraine. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to say that, when I began doing this work, we decided that we were going to go to shtetls. A shtetl, for those of you who don't know, is simply a small town. It's the Yiddish word for a small town. And most Jews living in Eastern Europe and parts of Poland, Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, as well as Belarus and Lithuania, lived in these small market towns. A shtetl could have a population of maybe 2,000 up to about 20,000. Depends, different people have different definitions of exactly what a shtetl is. And we always think of the shtetl as the place from which Eastern European Jewish culture emerged, the place from which it came, rather than the place that's still there. We think of the shtetl as being vanished or lost or erased, to just use the names of some books about the shtetl. And I have this slide from a book by Tzvi Kaminsky called Gewene mal a Stott Berdichev. There once was a town called Berdichev that talks about that idea of how these shtetls no longer exist. He writes, is there no longer a Berdichev? Yes, there is such a city. I can't get it. Yes, there is such a city that is still called Berdichev today. The city stands on the same place where Berdichev of bygone days once stood. The city is perhaps even bigger than Berdichev of bygone days. There are new houses, several stories completely built up. New streets have arrived, but the old streets and even the several remaining houses from old Berdichev seem somehow different, somehow foreign. And the people who you meet on the street are not the same Berdichev Jews. Here are the same people that you meet in any other town. And that speaks to the idea that these towns that were once maybe 90% Jewish, Berdichev was probably about 80% Jewish, after the Holocaust, they became mostly Ukrainian towns. There was complete ethnic cleansing in these towns, where towns that had large Jewish populations before the war had very little Jewish populations after the war. The shtetls almost ceased to exist. And I'm going to show you a little bit of video of one shtetl that we went to called Bershad, which was a very large majority Jewish town in its heyday. But now there's really very little life there, very little Jewish life there. It's a tragic reality that the Nazis destroyed the vast majority of small town Jewish life in Eastern Europe, murdering millions of people, of Jews, in the process. Yet there were, at least in 2000, still scattered Jewish communities in these towns. So I'm going to show you what Beersheba looks like, which is a small town, still has a Jewish street. And this street that I show you a picture of right now, there was a time when all of these houses were inhabited by Yiddish-speaking Jews. When we were there in 2002, still many of the towns were inhabited by Yiddish-speaking Jews. I'm just going to show you this video of us walking down the street, and you'll see people coming out and meeting us. And I hope you can hear the Yiddish. And he's saying that it was all Jewish at the time. You can see the on the houses there was still you could see the remnants of where the mezuzah once was.
Ja, da gehen ja gewohnt на вулице Заснева gewesen.
Наша пролетарская, народная, октябрьская.
And this is just banter. I think I can't put on the subtitles, but but they're just bantering about how all of these streets used to be called Proletarian Street, Soviet Street, Revolution Street, and now they're nothing, and they're just kind of laughing at that, and they're talking about how it was all entirely Jewish, how these towns were all entirely Jewish. Here's another video of a town called Shargorod, which also had a majority Jewish population at one point, still had a Jewish population when we visited, also in 2002. And you'll just kind of see what a typical shtetl looked like at that time. And you can see these are very typical, the architecture is very typical Jewish architecture. And people still refer to these houses as Jewish houses, even though they're no longer occupied by Jews. But because the houses around the marketplace tended to be owned by Jews. So people would call these marketplace houses Jewish houses simply by nature of the fact that, again, the marketplace was Jewish. So you can get a feel for what the town was like. And these were all stores. They were all stores. Each one of these houses would have had a store in the front. And then one part of it would have been a store, and then the people would have lived upstairs. So these pockets of places where there were still towns, where there were still Yiddish-speaking communities in the 2000s, is mostly in this area of Transnistria. And I just want to talk about why these communities survived. Because if you look at this map, there's a river Bug. You can see the southern river Bug over here. And on one side of the river Bug was the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. And this was the part of Ukraine that was directly incorporated into Germany, that was under direct German control during World War II. And there, in the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, there are no surviving shtetls. Every Jewish community was completely destroyed. You can still find individual Jews who are living in that area of Reichskommissariat Ukraine, but nobody survived as a community. The Jews that survived there, maybe they survived in hiding in Ukraine, that they could have, some of them dug themselves hideouts and managed to survive, managed to avoid massacres by hiding out. Others of them disguised themselves as Christians and managed to survive the war by passing as Christians. And others retreated to the east, or they fled to the east. They were evacuated to the east and survived in Russia proper or in Central Asia, and then returned to Reichskommissariat, to what was Reichskommissariat Ukraine after the war. So there's no intact communities in this part of Ukraine on that bank of the River Bug that survived. But Transnistria is this area of Ukraine between the Dniester River and the Bug River, the southern Bug River, that was under Romanian control rather than German control. And the Romanians committed atrocities against Jews as well, and set up concentration camps and massacred many Jews as well. But people also survived. And it's the one area in Ukraine where there were pockets of actual intact communities where people survived the war. They survived in ghettos predominantly, or sometimes in concentration camps. The Jews were ghettoized, and there were massacres in the ghettos, but some of them survived. So that's the area that we spent most of our time doing interviews. And here you can see me and my colleague Dov Ber Curler, who's wearing the, I guess, salmon-colored shirt there. And that's the two of us conducting an interview. This is in the town of Beersheba with somebody who was a tailor, and you can see all of his work behind him. He was still working as a tailor at the time. And this is how we conducted these interviews. This is another interview. This is my whole team conducting an interview in the town of Tomashpol, which was also in Transnistria, just by the border with Romania. So in total, my team conducted about 380 interviews with individuals born between 1910 and 1940. The interviews comprise about 800 hours of video. They're all videotaped interviews, and they're all available to search. The entire archive is available online. And we also have here a curated website in which you can see segments of the interviews in about 3 to 4 minutes. These segments that are organized by subject are all subtitled. And that's, for general audiences. And then the entire interview project, if you want to see all, 800 hours, it's available to search here. And there's detailed timelines where you can look through and you can go to exactly what you want to see in those interviews. So tonight, I want to spend most of the time where I'm going to be talking about life for these people right after World War II. I'm going to concentrate on their experiences either returning to the shtetls after the war. Many of them were in evacuation or in hiding, or those who survived in these ghettos where they lived what would have happened is they lived in the ghetto from 1941, which is when the ghettos were established in Ukraine. And then in 1943, when the Red Army came through, the Red Army liberated them. And they then joined the Red Army and fought along with the Red Army, moving all the way west, sometimes all the way to Berlin. And in fact, we interviewed one person who told us a crazy story of how he actually survived a massacre by hiding out inside a chimney. And he lived in this chimney for about 3 to 4 days while the Romanians, in this case, were rounding up people from the shtetl. He survived by hiding in the chimney. Then afterwards, he came out of the chimney and still survived in the ghetto for a little bit. And then the Red Army came and liberated his town. And when they liberated his town, he joined the Red Army and he made it all the way to Berlin and was there when the Red Army liberated Berlin and took over the Reichstag. And he claimed that he had actually written his name on the Reichstag. So that's a story of somebody who went from being a victim to being a victor. And this is very important in their memories, the importance that they see themselves as the people who defeated Nazism. They are members of the Red Army who defeated Nazism. And so we recorded, this is what I'm going to show you in the next video, we recorded in one town a rally on Victory Day in which you can see several of our informants marching with the hammer and sickle. And this was remarkable in 2003, 2003 Ukraine, to be marching through the streets with a hammer and sickle after the Ukrainians had had a revolution to overthrow Soviet rule. The hammer and sickle was not a particularly popular symbol, but these people felt so strongly that it is the Red Army that liberated them from the Nazis that they still celebrate it. So here you can see. And so that's just kind of, whoops. That's just an image of what those look like. And so the people that we interviewed, the first thing, the main moment of their life that they're most proud of is actually their experience during the war and their experience defeating what they regard themselves as having been the people who defeated Nazism. Of course, many other armies played a big role in defeating Nazism, but the Red Army suffered immensely and the Soviet Union suffered immensely. 27 million Soviet citizens were killed fighting the Nazis. And many of those were Jews. Jews suffered disproportionately. They fought disproportionately in the Red Army, and they died disproportionately fighting in the Red Army. And to me, when we were interviewing these people, this was something that was really interesting. I just want to show you, this is one person, a cap maker, actually. He made caps for a living. Most of the people that we interviewed had professions that were traditional artisan professions. They were cap makers, they were tailors, they were cobblers. So this guy made hats, made caps. And this is how we conducted our interviews. You'll see us greeting him in his home in Tomashpol. I'll play you that.
Geht, wem es geht. Ach, es geht. Ihr seid, wo der Weib, wenn der Freu.
Wo ist das?
Die Freu bei mir ist in der Ruhe. Ich bin nur.
Again, just talking, how are you? Nice to meet you. His name is Alexei Futuran. And I thought it was interesting because when we interviewed him, one of the first things he did is he rolled up his sleeve to show us the tattoo on his arm. Now, to me, that scene is just such a familiar, iconic scene of Holocaust memory. The idea of rolling up your sleeve to show a number that's tattooed on your arm, which I had interviewed Holocaust survivors before and known Holocaust survivors, and that seemed to be such a prominent part of those interviews. And here he rolled up his sleeve, but it wasn't a number that was tattooed on his sleeve, on his arm. It was a name, his name, Alyosha. His name is Alexei Futuran, or Alyosha. And he showed us how he had it tattooed on his arm. And he explained that the reason he has his name tattooed on his arm is because everybody in his unit tattooed their names when they were fighting the Nazis. In case they were killed, they wanted to be sure that their bodies could be identified. And assuming that they would be killed and that all of their ID and all their clothing would be stolen from them. So for him showing the tattoo on his arm is a signal of pride, of a reminder of those terrible days, and of pride in the role that he played in defeating Nazism. And I just thought that, really symbolizes the different ways in which Jews in Ukraine remember the Holocaust compared to, many Jews in Poland who remember it as being victims, and these people remember it as being victors. I'm going to show you another video that really gets to that idea. And this video is filmed in the town of Berdichev. Berdichev is more of a town than a shtetl. It's a larger city. We were in a soup kitchen that day, my team, and we just happened to be interviewing people in the soup kitchen. We found an elderly guy, and with the rabbi of Berdichev, who was with us, helping us find people, and we asked him, tell us about your life, tell us about your childhood in Berdichev. And I'm going to play you his answer. And his answer is, he doesn't tell us about his childhood in Berdichev. He says, when I was 13, I was sent to work. That's all he says. And then he says, but in 1939, I joined the army and I served in the Far East. And he explains that he fought in Stalingrad and that he helped to defeat Hitler. And then you'll see he takes out from his pocket a photo of him in full military regalia that he shows us and very proudly says, this is who I am. And it's, again, a symbol of when you ask these people 60 years after they'd fought in the army, who they are, what their childhood memory is. That's what he wants to talk about. And I'll emphasize, he had no idea that there was going to be an international film crew in the soup kitchen that day. So he must carry that photo with him wherever he goes. So I'll play you the video clip now.
Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem, Shalom, Milech Melech Malachim Lochem HaKodesh Baruch Hu.
David, verzeih etwas, David. Sag etwas. Du bist da geboren in der Baditschewe?
Ja, es geht.
Sag etwas. Verzeih etwas von Baditschewe. Du bist da geboren in der Baditschewe?
Ja.
Verzeih etwas von der Bist du gegangen in der Heide?
Ik ben gaan, ik ben nu al 13 jaar ben ik gaan arbeiten. Ik ben naar Stolia. Aan Mebischweg. En na 13 jaar ben ik gewerkt in de armee. Aber gedient Tirakianski Flot. Auf Dальний Восток. In 49 jaar zongen de Malchume. Also, hat me gewerkt auf dem Front. Я защищал Калининский фронт, Йидdish. Я защищал Калининский фронт, Нудом Сталинградский фронт. И übrigens in der 62. Armee, was мой гвардейский. Я вас на фотографии. In 45. Jahr ben ik gekomen in Berdichev, aber keinem nicht getroffen auf einem Drum. 7 Menschen. Dort in der Mama, die Schwester und die Brüder, und schon gekommen nur nach Fies. Kein Fies aber schon in Gott. Das ist mein Autobiografie. Und in 92. Jahr, mein Vater gestorben. Schon 2 Jahre sind nicht da. Kein Kinder aber nicht. Auch keinem nicht. Und ich bin schon noch 82 Jahre.
All right, so that's the story of David Foreman. And again, just to emphasize, the question that he was asked was, tell us about your childhood in Berdichev. And he answers it by immediately talking about his wartime experience and emphasizing the role that he played in defending Stalingrad. Again, he ends that he has absolutely nothing, which I'm sure was true, and pulls out that photo of himself, which is the one thing that he does have, is the pride of the role that he played in World War II. And, World War II and their Soviet role in defeating the Nazis was really a cult in the post-war Soviet Union that Jews could embrace as well. It was one way that Jews could really feel that they were part of the Soviet system is because of the role that they had played in defeating Nazism. I've got to play the next video. There we go. The next video that I'm going to play also gets to that point. This is a fellow by the name of Efim Skoblitsky, who was a lieutenant in the Soviet army. And he was running a battalion of tanks. But he is going to talk in this clip about the notion of revenge, which I think is something that you don't hear many Holocaust survivors talk about in America. It's isn't really in the lexicon. Elie Wiesel famously had a sentence about revenge in the Yiddish version of Night that he took out when he published it in French and in English, because he didn't think it was appropriate to be talking about revenge in those climates, in those languages, which I think is the way many people felt. But in the Soviet Union, they did talk about revenge. And I just want to play this clip of Skoblitsky, Efim Skoblitsky. He talks here about how his entire family was killed, and he names the people who were killed, but then he ends it with saying, but I got more of them than they got of me, than they got of mine, which I think is a very powerful statement. Again, proud of the role that he played as a victor rather than a victim. I'll play the clip.
Na 39. bin ich gegangen in der Armee, aber so gelernt auf Offizier. Aber gehandelt die Schule. Und geworden Offizier, ein Leutnant. Und dann wurde ich in 2 Jahren, aber gedacht, ich sollte mobilisieren, kommen rein. Hat es schon gegen den Malchume, hat mir mich Straße weggeschickt auf Stalingrad. Bin ich gewesen, Kommandier von der Batterie, von Armaten. 4 Armaten sind gewesen. Wir sind damals gewesen, Pferde gewesen, nicht keine Maschinen. Die Armaten haben geschleppte Pferde. Is der Futter in de Meter, wo in Mottele die Deutschen gearbeitet. Na, ich habe gesagt, mit denen zu rechnen. Ich habe mehr gearbeitet für sie. Ich habe für sie Stecker geschnitten.
Ihr seid gewählt 10 Jahre
10 Jahre in Armee.
in Armee. Gewählt Offizier
Offizier von der Artillerie. Ich bin ein Grammatenoffizier. Ich habe gekannt, ich habe 10 Klassen gehandelt. Also ich bin ein Grammatenoffizier.
Okay, so again, the pride in having served in the military, and at the end, he comments, I translated as I was a literate officer, a literate lieutenant, but really he's saying that he knew trigonometry, that he was quite well advanced. So the pride in the role that he played in the military. But he also mentions they killed everybody of his. They killed his entire family. He lists 8 people in his family who were killed. And this is another story that the people we interviewed encountered, which is, people have gone off to fight in wars for, as long as humans have existed, they've been going to war. It's the oldest story, the oldest human story is that men going out to fight in war. And traditionally, part of that story is that at the end of the war, they come home to their families and they're welcomed in by their families. This didn't happen for the Jews who fought in World War II in the Soviet Union. When they came home, they had no families left. They came home to find that their entire families had been killed. They knew, people like Efim Skablitsky, who was out fighting, he knew what the Nazis were about. And he knew that they were killing Jews and massacring Jews in his hometown. But still, they couldn't imagine the extent of it. I think he imagined when he came back, he was from Berdichev. I think he imagined when he came back to Berdichev, a town that at one point had had, what, 30,000 people, maybe he imagined 15,000 would be killed. And he came back and found 29,900 had been killed, or whatever the numbers are. But just, there was nobody left, nobody in their community left. And to make things more difficult, they didn't even have homes to return to. There were huge housing shortages in the Soviet Union, particularly during the war. And so many of these people left to fight or were in hiding or whatever the case may be, and then came back to their homes and found their homes occupied by Christians. Their neighbors had moved into their houses. We interviewed one person in the town of Bratslav who commented that we actually interviewed him. He was living in an old home, in an old Jewish house. And we said, "Is this the house that you were born in?" And he said, "No, I was actually lived in the house across the street. But when I came back from the war, my house was occupied. So I managed to move into this house." So the Jewish veterans fared even worse. They expected they would come back, be welcomed by families, or even if not welcomed by families, they expected that the Soviet Union would give them awards, would repay them like the GI Bill did in America. They expected that they would have the gratitude of their nation, and instead they didn't even have houses to move into. So this is a clip of what's his name? Geller, Shimon Geller, I think is his name. Talking, he was in evacuation. He wasn't fighting in the war. He managed to flee east and live out the war in Central Asia. But when he came back, as you can see, this one I don't have subtitles, but the text underneath, they had to kick their neighbors out of their house and make a new life for themselves because the people had moved in. So I'll play you this clip.
Wat me dat toen een boyen als me nooit eens van een spitaal, me ga weg voor een incident toch met de mama geweest in democratie. Ik ga zeggen nemen en ik kan het tomer. Ik moet het tomer, me dat thuis wachten de schijnen moet om van nemen de stiep. En me toen geven maken een nieuw leven. Zijn geweest niet kan battle, niet kan tissel, niet kan wind niet gewinnen zag. Maar toen ging boy naar een nieuw leven. No. En 41 jaar, begassen gehad, bij Yiddish dochter. Hoe begreep het met hier? 48 jaar.
Okay, so there you can hear him talking about the difficulty of returning and trying to start a new life for themselves. And this idea, he says, he ends his story in 1949, I got married and lived with my wife for 48 years. This was a time when, like in the United States, there was a baby boom, but in particular, among the Jews, they really looked for, any way to get married and to start a family because they had no families. So these are people who often came from, big families of, 10 kids plus extended families and knowing everybody in the town that they were born in and growing up in very vibrant communities. I was going to say wealthy, but not actually wealthy monetarily, but very vibrant communities full of Jewish life, and came back and there was nobody. And so they had to make families for themselves by getting married in any means that they could. Additionally, many weren't even able to go to their homes because you needed a permit to live in many overcrowded cities. You needed to prove that you were a resident in the city before. To get into Kiev, for instance, you needed to prove that you were a resident before the war because of this housing shortage. And the people who had fled or who had survived killings and mass graves didn't have the documentation to prove that they lived in the city before the war. As a result of which, there were many Jews literally wandering around from town to town, trying to find any community that would let them in, any place to live, because they didn't have a home to go back to because the home had been taken away, and they didn't have documentation to even prove that they lived in the city that they wanted to move into. Here's another story. This is Eliza. Yevgenia Kozak talking about her experiences coming back.
En 14 maart dat nu in Berset. En dat zal april, dat zal nog gekomen naar het eerste.
Welke jaar?
En 44. Dan 44. Dan zijn we gekomen naar het eerste.
Wo seid ihr gefunden in Berset, dass wir gekommen
Wir sind gekommen, ist in der Stiebe gewesen, aber es ist gewesen schon ein anderer Mensch. Wir haben kommen da. Und sie ist geworden geblieben. Noch sie gewesen, die Tante, was man zu tragen, die gewesen 2 Kinder. Haben wir das zu sagen. Und so haben wir gewesen an einem, und der Mama gebacken Brot gemacht. Und der Tochter pflege, a Kirche pflege ihnen doch. Da.
So you also see, I mean, with Yevgenia Kozak talking about how when she came back, her home was still standing, but it was occupied. They couldn't move in. So they lived with their aunt. And she also talks about how they made a living. She actually had several people surviving because she was in Berset. So she was in this part of Transnistria where communities were able to survive. Unlike in Berdichev, which, as I mentioned earlier, in Reichskommissariat Ukraine, no communities survived. But in Berset and Transnistria, there were some. So she still had an aunt who was alive, and her parents were still alive. So they managed to continue living, but not in the same house that she was living in. Now, the return of some Jews to reclaim their houses created resentment and led to increased anti-Semitism, because a lot of the people who moved into these houses, the Christians who moved into the property that the Jews vacated, wanted to keep that property. And they saw the Jews coming back as a threat to their ability to keep it. And that then led to new anti-Semitism. And a lot of the Christians who occupied these Jewish houses thought that they were abandoned. And some of them really thought they were abandoned, didn't know what was going on, and didn't realize what had happened. And so are surprised when somebody comes back. They've been living in this house for 3 years, 4 years sometimes, and somebody comes back and says, no, this is my house. So that created a lot of resentment and made things difficult. Here, this is Donia Pressler talking about in the town of Tulchin and her experiences coming back after the war.
Sind wir gekommen von dem ganzen Piece. Wie sind wir gegangen zu Kentucky? Und ein Stieb, wenn sie Stieb hatten zu nehmen. Wir haben gegangen wie zusammen, dachten wie die Gette gewesen. Hatten gewinn zwei zerbrochene Stiebe, hatten sich weil die Stieb dachten, der Mama ist Sabrina, die gewinn Gitterstieb. Sie haben gewinn, die Christen haben gewinn. Und wir sind im Kämpfen im Lager und haben gemeint, ich hatte schon einen Saratschki, Abramczyk. Ich sage, im besantigen Tug, ist auch nicht lieb damit. No, wo sie denn?
So again, just to clarify, she's saying that when they came back, people started calling the Jews insulting names, calling them Sarochka, Brumchika, and to this day, she says they still don't like Jews, referring to her neighbors. Just kind of an interesting perspective. Most of them actually got along very well with non-Jews after the war, but that perception that something had changed. And here in this interview, we see references to that I'll play you now about returning to Heisen, a town in Reichskommissariat Ukraine, what was Reichskommissariat Ukraine. He talks where there was a surviving Jewish community. He says that there were still Jews that were around. They spoke Yiddish, but they were embarrassed to speak it on the streets. And he says, well, I'll play you the clip, but he says he worked with another Jew. They spoke Yiddish to each other, but only when nobody could hear. That because of this rising anti-Semitism, a lot of Jews became ashamed of their Jewishness during this period. Here's the...
Nur der Malchume. In 45. Jahr, wenn es gekommen von der Revokatie, die Jiden, kein Geichen. Musst du gewähnen, dass dann nur sagen, 1000 Jiden. Nur der Malchume. Aus dem Gerät auf Jiddisch. Und gerät auf Jiddisch. Na, wir haben schon Paskinen gerät auf Jiddisch.
Was heißt Paskinen?
Wir haben sich geschämt reden auf Jiddisch.
Was soll ich sagen?
Ich versteht?
Ich verstehe, ja.
Wat, man hat sich geschämt reden auf Jiddisch in Goas, in unserer Queit, na, so zwischen sich, ich habe gearbeitet von Arbeit. Als mit mir gearbeitet, ich habe Jid. Er ist genährt von mir, für 2 Jahre. Wat. Und wir ständig gerät auf Jiddisch, das war keine Antern.
So so again, they returned to Yiddish or they returned to their shtetls where they were embarrassed to speak Yiddish. One of the other problems that these returning folks had, whether they were returning from the military, whether they were coming out of hiding, whether they were returning from evacuation, is that they had a profound need to mourn the dead, to mourn all of their relatives who had been killed. And, most Jewish traditions, most Jewish religious rituals can be performed in isolation, but mourning is to say Kaddish, is one thing that you need a minyan for. And many of them didn't have minions around. There weren't even 10 people in town who could say Kaddish. So a lot of them talk about the difficulties of finding enough people to say Kaddish in order to mourn their lost ones. Many also talked about the need to erect some type of monument to recognize the dead. And in town after town, they erected monuments where there had been massacres. And often these monuments were forbidden. They weren't allowed. The government didn't want specific monuments put up. So they would do so in secret. And thankfully, most of the killing sites were in the forests, deep in the forests. So they could erect a stone in the forest that was out of view of the officials of the town, but where they put them there in order to be seen and so that they could remember for themselves. Play you the next video. Here's another, this is Abba Kaviner, talking about his return and about the need to build a synagogue and to start a new synagogue in order to accommodate all of these mourners. Interestingly, one person that we interviewed, I don't think I have the video of her, but one person we interviewed talked about a fight in the community, whether to use the bricks. There was a pile of bricks in town from destroyed houses that had been destroyed during the war, whether they should use those bricks to rebuild the synagogue or to rebuild individual houses. And the belief was, the synagogue is a communal building that people need, whereas the houses are individual, but of course people needed houses as well. And she says the wealthy members of the community wanted the synagogue, but the poor members of the community, of course, wanted houses. And just about the conflicts within the community over where to prioritize resources. So here's an interview also about the community fixing the synagogue.
As die Jiden haben sich umgekehrt für die Evakuation ist gekommen. Man hat gesehen, die größte Schild kämen nicht viel. Man darf machen einen größeren Mond. Und die katholische Schild ist eine kleine. Es hat gegeben, die katholische Schild. Es gewinnt ein lächerlicher Dach und eine Stelle und ein Pol noch 4 Wände. En door een kouders. En die kan je ook van de wapens weten. Niet kijken die kalteren. Was de tijd gewin schwer. De wingere gewin groß. Haben Gieden gegeben de letzte kopje. En wat meer weniger gemacht. Zuerst gemacht een dag. Gemacht een stelle. Gemacht een pol. So
again, about how the Jews were able to establish a synagogue and to pray in the aftermath of the horrors that they had seen during the war. I'll play you, I'm kind of running low on time, so I'll play just a couple others. This is about the return to Bratslav again. And in this case, her talking about getting married. Again, that point that I made about the profound need that people felt to start a family. And in fact, many people that we interviewed said this was the greatest moment of their life. The best moment of their life was returning home after the war, for obvious reasons, because of the horrors that they'd endured, but also it was the time that they started families and that they had little children. Some people delayed the time that they started and remained in the military, actually. Jews were more likely likely than others to remain in the military after the war ended. The war ended in 1945. Many Jews still stayed in the military until 1952 even, because they had nowhere else to go. So again, unable to go home, unable to join families, unable to join communities. The only community they had was the military. But I'll play you this interview about about starting a new family.
Wenn gekommen in Broslev, hab ich ne Gott nicht in Stieb, wenn ich ne Gott wie zu schlufen. Wenn ich ein paar Gäubre getrunken Wasser auf der Karomsel, ich hab gewaschen, hab den Schwendel 16 Jahre, aus Treuen auf Arbeit hab ich nicht gekannt. Der Fach für 18 Jahre hat uns Treuen arbeiten. Nur aber sich sie geschrieben, 2 Jahre. Ist mit dem aber gearbeitet auf dem Piefsavod. Leger waschen die Fässer, Fäkatschen dem Bier. Und der heute ist der 2, aber hoffentlich Gott.
Wie hast du das getroffen mit deinem Mann?
Mein Mann ist gewesen, er kam von der Armee. Das ist gewesen mit der Motkis, mit der Radio, mit der Faum. Hat er mir das gesehen, hat er meint, er bin ein Schicksal. Ist mir zu retten, na so beschert gewesen. Er soll uns nein, wir wollen gewusst. Und er soll bechossen, Gott. Gott, 2 Kinder sollen dann den Tisch stark.
Okay. And this is another interview that really reflects that idea about how they got married. And he talks about how difficult it was to find a chuppah, to put up a chuppah and to celebrate, because you weren't allowed to be openly Jewish during this period, but yet they managed to do so. And I'll conclude on this video because it's really, it concludes on a kind of lighter level about talking about starting a new family, about starting a new life.
Ja.
Ja, de beste jongen, ik weet man, ben nog eens ingekeerd van de Malkume. En dat ging. Ik kind het. Hoe is het kind dan beter? Ik ben weg naar de Malkume, heb gelust. Kinder, ben kimmer van de Malkume, zijn ze gewoon in school. Het is beste, men als ik ingekeerd heb, dat is een beetje te maken. Nog eens gewoon op te strooien, ze gaan schwer. Nog eens ooit gestrooid, ook al wat aber machine. Dus ik ben de beste jongeman.
Okay, my back, yeah. All right, so so I think those are the interviews that I'll end on. I'll just say, a couple concluding words here. The one is these people's lives. I mean, we interviewed 300 people or so. These were very difficult lives. I mean, the people that we interviewed, the eldest were born around 1910. In their childhood, when they were very little children, they suffered through World War I, much of which was fought over Ukraine. When World War I ended in 1918, a whole new war began in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Wars of Independence and the Russian Revolutionary Wars. And this was a period, my last book is about these pogroms. This was a period during which 100,000 Jews were killed in pogroms between 1918 and 1922 in Ukraine. And these people suffered through those pogroms between 1918 and 1922. Immediately after that came famine of 1921. There was a big famine in Ukraine, and that was followed by arrests and Stalinization in the late 1920s. And then the huge famine, the Holodomor in Ukraine, that resulted in the deaths of about 3.5 million people in the early 1930s. And then that was followed by Stalin's Great Terror. And again, huge arrests throughout these communities in the late 1930s. And as soon as that ended, and that period of massive industrialization and arrests followed, World War II begins, and the decimation of these communities during the Holocaust and during the war. After the war, 1945, there's a period of new Soviet anti-Semitism, official anti-Semitism. You may have heard of the Doctor's Plot comes from this period. And now they suffer anti-Semitism, and they're, not allowed to rise up in positions. They're not allowed to go to schools. There's quotas on the schools. This goes through this period of stagnation, which is when they live most of their professional lives, is during the difficult periods of stagnation in the mid-Soviet period of the 1960s, 1970s. And then their entire world comes crashing down with perestroika and complete remaking of the Soviet Union, and then the breakup of the Soviet Union in Ukraine, in the independent Ukrainian state, right as they are reaching their retirement, their age of retirement. And this means that most of their families, their children, leave Ukraine and are living in Israel or living in America, leaving them there alone. So these are very difficult lives that they lived through. And maybe I'll just conclude with one little story about one interview that we did with, it was an elderly woman, and her son was sitting next to her for much of the interview. Her son was like a younger guy in his 40s, maybe, kind of gruff, and she was an elderly little lady. And she said, in conclusion, she said, I lived a good life. Everything was good. And then her son interjected and said, no, it wasn't. You were poor. You were miserable. You lived a terrible life. And I always thought that was interesting, that her son interjected that way and tried to reframe her life. Now, first of all, the whole idea of did you live a good life and answering that question is just an impossible question to answer. But I think it's interesting. I feel for the son who had probably spent his life hearing all of her terrible stories of woe and listening to her complain about everything that she'd experienced. And now there's an international film crew there recording her life. And for posterity, she decides to frame it as a good life. And that bothered him because we're getting off easy. We're not hearing the difficult stories. But from her perspective, in her ending days and knowing that this is the way she's going to be remembered and giving her memories for posterity, she chose to reflect on her life as being a life well lived and a good life. And to me, that was a very important lesson on, how to view all of our lives. And one of the main things I learned from this. So I'll end on that and happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Professor Veidlinger, for such an engaging talk with fascinating and yet difficult stories. For those of you with questions, please continue to send them in. And let's begin with, there's a question here, how did you find people to interview, and were there people who wouldn't speak with you?
Yeah, great question. So how did we find people to interview? There's a few ways that we found them. One is we would get in touch with a local rabbi who knew people we could interview, or we would get in touch with a community leader. There were great organizations. The Joint Distribution Committee, for instance, had food kitchens set up for Jewish residents all over, and we could get in touch with somebody from the Joint Distribution Committee or the Federation of Jews who would have a list of people. So we were able to use official organizations. Once we got in touch with people, then there's a snowball technique where they would get us in touch with other people who get us in touch with other people. Another way that we did it sometimes, particularly in very small towns, was just rolling into town and going to the central square and asking, anybody here Jewish? Anybody here speak Yiddish? And my colleague Dov Ber-Kurler would find the oldest person he could find and just find some elderly person walking down the street saying, hey, do you know anybody who speaks Yiddish? And the old, he would say that in Russian. And the old person would say, oh, yes, I do know somebody. I'll take you there. And then he would come with us, sometimes hop in the car with us. Sometimes we get out of the car and walk. And he'd go and he'd, tap on the window of some old house and, yell into it, Yevreika, Jewess, which is, what they would call each other. And an old woman would come out, an old Jewish woman would come out speaking in Yiddish. So it always struck me as interesting that they knew who the Jews were in these small towns. And these are, small towns, maybe population of a couple thousand, 5,000. And the old people knew who the Jews were and were perfectly happy to take us there to interview them. As far as did anybody not want to speak to us, it absolutely amazed me that everybody wanted to speak to us. And we would meet people in a soup kitchen, we would meet people on the street, we would meet people in a synagogue. And every time we met somebody, it seemed like they'd been waiting their entire lives for somebody to come up to them with a video camera and say, "Can you tell me about your life?" It's amazed me. And in fact, I have a TED talk on that topic, tell me about your life. Just the importance of asking people stories, of getting people to talk about their lives. That, again, it was astounding how you put a camera in front of somebody and they want to talk. The times that we had problems was when there was a child. The children, 40, 50-year-old children, would often say, "Oh, my mother, she doesn't want to talk to you. She'll never want to talk to you. My mother never talks about her stories. My mother doesn't want to talk about the war. My mother doesn't want people to know that she's Jewish," or whatever. We would get stories like that. Sometimes we would convince this guy, "Okay, well, just take us to your mother anyway." And he would. And as soon as we meet the mother, out she comes, full of stories, dying to talk to us. So I thought that was interesting too, the way that the children are often gatekeepers. And in fact, much of it was because the children were embarrassed about their Jewish background. And particularly in these small towns, the children didn't want everyone to know that their parents are Jewish because the children may not regard themselves as Jewish. So for them, this is sometimes a secret that they're trying to keep people from knowing. But yeah, but everybody wanted to talk.
Yeah, that's amazing that they all wanted to talk. And I also think it's interesting that the children were trying to avoid it. So there's actually a couple questions here about young people in the town. So just following that, was there, so some later generations continue to live in the towns and they don't see themselves as Jewish, or they're not even as identify as Jewish?
Yeah, particularly in the small towns. We focused our interviews on small towns. There's a lot of Jews in Kiev, a lot of Jews in Lviv, and the bigger cities. The reason that we were interested in small towns, and I should have said this, is the main purpose of the whole project was linguistic. Whereas my colleague Dov Curler, who was leading it, is a linguist, and he wanted to trace the way language changes from town to town. And so we were interested in looking for people who are still living in the town in which they were born. And that means, since in 1900, 1920, most Jews were living in small towns, we have to find them in small towns. If we go to the big city, if we go to Kiev, everybody in Kiev was born in a small town and moved to Kiev. So everybody elderly. So that's why we focused on small towns. And I've forgotten what the question was, why I was going there. Do you remember? Oh, the children. Right. So in the small towns, it's very rare to meet uh, children who regard themselves as Jewish. In many cases, the people that we interviewed had had several marriages, and maybe one of the marriages or multiple marriages were not with a Jewish person, and so the children don't regard themselves as Jewish. Sometimes both parents were Jewish, but the children still don't regard themselves as Jewish because they grew up in the Soviet Union and religious life was constrained. So the parents may have seen their Jewishness as deeply rooted in the Yiddish language and not necessarily religious practice. And that wasn't passed on. So the children don't regard themselves as Jewish, even though they may understand Yiddish. They don't use it as their language. And so they still live in the town. Among those who regarded themselves as Jewish, they're very unlikely to live in the small town. They most likely moved to Israel, to Brooklyn, to America, or to Kiev. The same way, in the United States, you go to a small town where there used to be, the book I'm writing right now is on Jewish life in the Great Plains of the United States. And there, I go to a town like Joplin, Missouri, there used to be a pretty lively Jewish community, and now there's very few people left. Or Webb City, Missouri, these towns. So similar, the Jews have moved to the bigger cities, and in Ukraine, mostly out of Ukraine.
Thank you. And with that in mind, is there not like, are there not very many structures left of communal Jewish life, like like if they're not, they're not practicing publicly, it sounds like.
Yeah, so the structures of Jewish life were mostly closed down after the war, because of the communist system, where they didn't allow religious observance. In some cases, little synagogues were reestablished after the war, but because of communist repression of religion by the 1960s, by the 1970s, they were mostly closed. There were very few functioning synagogues. Um, in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, new communities sprouted up, led by, Chabad in particular, which moved in and opened up communities and has done, great work there. But that now also is fading as the elder generation is dying away and the younger generation is moving out. And now, since the full-scale Russian invasion, I think even fewer Jews are still living in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's understandable. There's a whole bunch of people have actually asked whether or not you speak Yiddish and how you learned Yiddish, and then just as a follow-up to that, did the people speak other languages other than Yiddish, or was it something they continued to use over time?
Yeah, so I do speak Yiddish, and I learned Yiddish. Actually, I went to an elementary school where they taught Yiddish. Bialik Hebrew Day School in Toronto, Ontario is where I grew up. Learned Yiddish there. Didn't really learn it all that well, but learned more Yiddish than most, 13-year-olds know. So I learned enough Yiddish. And then I went to graduate school to study Russian history. I studied Russian in undergraduate. I went to McGill University and studied Russian history at the time. It was the late 1980s, and Russia was just opening up, and it seemed like there was going to be all of this economic opportunity, and it seemed like Russia was going to be some bastion of democracy, and we were sorely mistaken. But I learned Russian and then went to graduate school to study Russian history. And one of the very first assignments I had in graduate school was to go into a Russian archive. Actually, it was in Washington, D.C. I went to Georgetown. So I went to the National Archives where there was the Smolensk Archive, which is an archive, a Russian archive that was captured by the U.S. Army and held in the National Archives in D.C. So I went there and we had to find a document and write about the document, write an analysis of the document. And I was going through this archive and I found a document in Yiddish about the creation of a Jewish cultural circle in some town in Ukraine. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I'll see if I can read it. And I was able to read it and make out what it was about. So I wrote a little article about that. And then my professor saw it and said, wow, you read Yiddish, you should really study Jews. You should study something that uses the Yiddish language, since so few people, read it. So I decided to write my dissertation on Yiddish theater in the Soviet Union. And that was my first book, The Moscow State Yiddish Theater, which was on a Yiddish theater that Stalin supported and helped establish in the Soviet Union in order to convey communist ideologies to Yiddish-speaking Jews. So yeah, I do speak Yiddish. And there was another part of the question that I've already forgotten.
Yeah, and then there's really two questions. I was just giving you both at the same time. The whether or not the people spoke Yiddish throughout that time period,
Oh yeah.
what other languages they spoke, and how often they might have used Yiddish today.
Yeah. Yeah, so most of them did not. Most of them spent a long time not using Yiddish. They grew up in Yiddish. Yiddish is their mother tongue. And then after the war, most of the Yiddish speakers were gone, and they switched and mostly use Russian. Many also speak Ukrainian. In Ukraine, Russia is a very commonly spoken first language and even second language. Volodymyr Zelensky, his first language is Russian. So it's very common for Ukrainians to have Russian as their first language. Even Ukrainian patriots speak Russian as their first language. So among the Jews in particular, they were more likely to speak Russian as their second language or their first language than Ukrainian. So most of them, in fact, I think everybody that we interviewed spoke Russian, and most of them also spoke Ukrainian.
Thank you. Somebody here is asking about the architecture. You had noted that the houses that were Jewish were identifiable that way, and if there's anything more that you want to elaborate on Jewish
Yes, they tend to be different colors. They tend to be not wood, but I'm blanking on the term for what they're made of, but they're made like thatched. It's a type of lime with straw in between and lime on the outside. There's a word for it that I'm blanking on. But mainly because they are urban houses instead of country houses. So the way a typical shtetl looks is there's a center market square. There's a market square, and the houses around the market square were the Jewish houses because Jews were the people who ran the markets. Overwhelmingly, the markets were run by Jews. And then as you go out from the town in kind of concentric circles, you get towards the fields, and the fields were Ukrainian houses. And the houses towards the fields tended to be wood houses, and the houses in the middle tended to be these thatched houses. They were also colored. They tended to have different colors. They tended to be painted because they doubled as stores. So people had their stores on one floor and then they lived up above. And so for that reason, also their structure, they're built a little bit differently. So one can look at these houses and instantaneously tell by the era in which the marketplace was built up compared to the era in which the fields were built up, and the structure of the house that is a Jewish house. Of course, the house doesn't have ethnicity, but that it was, that Jews lived there.
Yeah, yes, thank you. There's a question here. You mentioned that, the Jewish soldiers, when they returned, weren't offered anything in particular. Were non-Jewish veterans treated any better?
No.
No.
The Soviet Union was not did not have the equivalent of the GI Bill. They were lauded, they were awarded medals, but they weren't given housing. They weren't, the Soviet Union wanted to honor and create this cult around the war because the greatest victory that the Soviet Union had was the victory over Nazism. Never succeeded at doing much else. But that became the myth. That became the Great Patriotic War, as they called it, was really the uniting myth of the Soviet Union in the post-war period. But it had to be a myth because the experiences of soldiers were actually deeply problematic. And if you spoke to soldiers about the support that they'd gotten from the government and about what they had to do in the zones that they were liberating, the stories were not all that great. So they had to silence a lot of that. So the soldiers themselves tended not to be treated well, although they were lauded and celebrated, but not actually treated well. I think one could say the same, about a lot of the experience that American soldiers had coming back from certain wars.
Thank you. Yes, and there's a couple questions here about whether or not they were still coping with anti-Semitism, and whether or not they were. It says, well, this question I'll just read it. How would you compare the anti-Semitism in Ukraine with the current situation here? I'm assuming the U.S. from this person, but in the world today.
Yeah. The best phrase on anti-Semitism I heard, actually from one of the people we were interviewing, Abba Kavina, who I actually showed you, is he said, anti-Semitism was, anti-Semitism is, and anti-Semitism will be forever. Mirroring the Adon Olam, hu haya, hu aveva, hu yeh v'tifara. Anti-Semitism was, anti-Semitism is, and anti-Semitism will be forever. It varies, of course, immensely in the way that it's expressed. And in Ukraine, Jews have been blamed for a lot in Ukraine, as well as in Russia. And I think similarly today, there's people look for Jews who are, who have positions of power and blame everything on them. So a lot of those, the Russians blame Jews for a lot of the Ukrainian independence movement. They speak about, you'll hear Russian right-wing, newspapers talk about the Zelenskys and the Soroses, equating George Soros and Zelensky, meaning the Jews, liberalism, democracy, cultural pluralism. These are all huge threats to Russia right now. And Russia sees that they can discredit those ideas by blaming them on Jews, by saying these are, Jewish imported ideas. They're not real. By the same token, there are several, oligarchs who are propping Putin up, who are of Jewish ancestry. And so they can also be blamed by the other side that says, Putin is being supported by Jews. So Jews do get blamed on both sides of the conflict in Ukraine, in the same way that in many conflicts, Jews are blamed on both sides. In the Revolutionary Wars of 1918 to 1921, that my most recent book was about, I write that Jews were blamed for being capitalists. Jews were blamed for being communists. Jews were blamed for siding with the Germans, for siding with the Poles, for siding with the Ukrainians. Jews were blamed for supporting the Red Army, supporting the White Army. No matter which side you were on, there was a Jew to blame. And I think it's similar today. At the same time, surveys show Ukraine is one of the least anti-Semitic countries in Europe. Right-wing parties receive much less support in Ukraine than they do in almost any other European country, including France and Germany, in which the right-wing parties are making significant gains, and in Ukraine they're not. Ukraine has a Jewish president, and nobody cares. That's not even an issue. And for a while, it had a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister, and nobody cared. Today Ukraine is really a vibrant, multi-ethnic country that takes great pride in that. While at the same time, it does have a right-wing sector, and it has a history of Nazism, and there are some people who try to revive that history. But it's a small minority. Ukraine has had three revolutions since 1992, three full revolutions, and each one was a revolution to bring Ukraine into the democratic West, into really an idealized vision of the democratic West. So right now, it's like every other country, it still has problems, but I think not quite as much.
Yeah, thank you. For the Jews that you were interviewing, did they have a sense of how Jews were doing in the rest of the world, or the outside in Israel and in the US, our connections to it?
Yeah, they're pretty well connected because many of them have family there. So many of them have family who visit them occasionally. Sometimes when we interviewed people, because we would go in the summer, and that's when many of them had family from Israel visiting, family from America visiting. So yes, they're very well connected, and in fact, much more aware than their neighbors are of the world. In fact, there were instances where people would go. Their children maybe would go to spend some time in Israel, spend some time in America, and then come back to Ukraine and build businesses in Ukraine because they learned techniques of how do you run a restaurant, how you run a Western style restaurant. They would go and open up the first, cafe in these small towns that at the time only had, the old Soviet style cafes that were government run, somebody had taken over. And they would open up, a internet cafe or whatever it was at the time. So a lot of the kind of new businesses where people were Jews who had received the know-how from spending time abroad.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Question here, did anyone want to be compensated for being interviewed?
We did compensate them. We compensated everybody with just a small amount. I think it was $20. I can't remember exactly how much, but everybody got something for their time. And they signed consent forms. We had, huge consent forms that the university made us have everybody sign that was, such ridiculous legalistic language that, they couldn't really understand what they're signing. But we were very careful to explain on video what the interview is for, why we're doing it, how it's going to be preserved, and to get to get real informed consent. Signing some form that they don't understand is not real informed consent. Real informed consent is speaking to people and explaining what you're doing, why you're doing it, and getting their approval.
Yes, that's great. And is there anything, somebody just asked, the question popped up, should we be helping them in any way? Or is there, I don't know if how many are still living today, maybe as part of the
Yeah, I
question.
mean, of the people that we interviewed, very few are living today. But I'll tell you what I learned is the value of the Joint Distribution Committee, which gives aid to Jews wherever they are for whatever needs they have, without promoting any ideology, without trying to convince them to eventually move to Israel, which is also nothing against that. That's a laudable goal too. But the JDC just does incredible work. So I think that's probably the best way of helping these people and helping Jews wherever they are around the world who are in need.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. A few people asked about specific locations. I may not pronounce them correctly, and you may not know anything, but somebody asked if there were still Jews in Kamenets-Podilsky.
Yeah, I went to Kamenets-Podilsky. Uh, I don't know if there are still people there. We didn't find many people when we went. And we're not just looking for Jews, we're looking for Yiddish speakers in particular. But we went there and visited because one of my colleagues had family from there, so we went to Kamenets-Podilsky. We didn't conduct any interviews there.
Oh,
Beautiful town to visit.
Great. Yeah, that's good. What about the shtetl called Ananyev?
Ananyev. There's a few shtetls called Ananyev. So I'm not sure which one. Yeah, we don't have interviews from there. The project was actually called AHEYM, AHEYM, which was an acronym for the Archives of Historical and Ethnographic Yiddish Memories, but it also means homeward in Yiddish. So our website is aheym.com. I think that's our website. Maybe aheym.org. I can't remember which. But one of those is our website. And it has links that'll take you to all of the towns in which we've conducted interviews. And it also has a link that can take you to the place where all of the interviews are held, where you can actually look through and see.
Great. Yeah, somebody also asked if how to see the videos, and so we'll include that link on any follow-up email that we send later this week. So
I'll figure out whether it's .com or .org. I know it used to be one, we changed it to the other. I can't remember which we changed it to. But if you just type in AHEYM, AHEYM, you'll get to it.
great. And was there a special linguistic finding that your colleague made about the evolution of Yiddish?
He made a lot. I mean, really what he's trying to do is to identify Ukrainian Yiddish. There's distinctions between, Litvak Yiddish and Polish Yiddish, and Ukrainian Yiddish is kind of in between in some ways. And so that's what he's a specialist on. But I'll let him answer that in greater detail.
Has there been any follow-up with the children of these interviews, or
Not that I've done. The project for me, the project ended in 2010. It was based at Indiana University, which is where I used to teach. I left Indiana University in 2012 or 2013. I now teach at University of Michigan, and I haven't done that much with it since. Dov Bear has gone back and has interviewed these people and kept in touch with them a little bit more than I have. I came along in 2002. I went along for the first one, really just for fun. It was Dov Bear's project, linguistic project, and the interviews consisted at the time of a huge questionnaire that he had where he read words in Russian and asked them what the word was in Yiddish because he was looking for linguistic information. And at the end of the interviews, there was a little segment where he'd say, all right, he wanted to get free speech. So he would say, all right, tell me a little bit about your life. And then they would answer. And I'm a historian. I was listening to these stories about tell me about your life. And I was just amazed at the stories that I was hearing. So I decided to concentrate on those parts of the interviews and write a book about the experiences that they had. So that's kind of my involvement in it. The project continued as a linguistic project, but I was interested in, less interested in how they were saying it and more interested in what they were saying.
Yes, yeah, thank you. There's a question here about the ownership, the Jewish ownership of the land. I mean, in some areas there were different laws. If you want to say more about, like, a lot of the story was people returning to their homes and how.
Yeah, people owned homes. People owned homes. People could own land. Jews could own land. Certainly after the revolution in Russia, Jews were able to own lands on par with non-Jews, and even before it was possible for Jews to own land in certain circumstances.
Great, thank you. And a number of other people have asked about specific towns. I can ask them to you if you want, or we can direct them to the website with follow-up material. I wasn't sure if.
Yeah, the best is probably to direct them to the websites. Jewish Gen has a Shtetl finder. If you look at the jewishgen.org website, has great information on Shtetl. So that's usually where I direct people to when they're asking, because most of them, if we've been to it, it's on the website, on our website.
Yeah, that's great. And we'll definitely include all of the links in any follow-up. And then just as we come to a close here, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave us with for this, for this evening?
No, just other than, my thoughts are with the people of Ukraine who are, undergoing tremendous suffering. as a result of the full-scale Russian invasion. I'd also encourage people to, to help out if they're looking to help the people of Ukraine, to help them with funding, with pressuring our government to provide aid to people in Ukraine and military aid to Ukraine, because right now they're defending, democratic traditions for all of us right now, and are in desperate need of support.
Yes, thank you. I think that's an important point to end on, and important in our current world. So thank you once again for sharing your expertise and sharing these stories with us, and as difficult as they can be, and tackling all these insightful questions. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Pleasure, my pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again soon. So take care.